On the show today, I have Bruce Hallas, who I interview all the way from France. Bruce is a passionate advocate of information security. He's also a trainer, a consultant, and a speaker. Sorry, it's not just information security. He actually talks about information security awareness, behaviour, and culture. Bruce has written a book called Rethinking the Human Factor, and he also has a podcast of the same name. He helps support organizations through governance, risk, compliance programs, and he's developed this framework called the Security Awareness, Behavior, and Culture Framework, or SABAC, as he calls it, which he uses to help coach organizations around how to have their security policies and messages have the most impact. Their programs programs that actually look at the different mechanisms that humans have to change behavior and culture and to make them really, really, really effective. On the show, we discuss the quality of security programs, and if security was a product, would you buy it? And then once you'd bought it, was it good quality and would you buy it again? We also discuss the fact that you need to reinforce positive or the good behaviors that we do have in organizations around security, as well as trying to focus messages to those behaviors that we want to change as well. So not neglecting the good behaviors over the bad behaviors. We discuss understanding the objectives of different stakeholders in order to be able to communicate effectively with them around security, and really trying to find out what their KPIs are so that we can speak in the same language they speak. And also, Bruce and I discuss what design principles and how they can be used in security programs to kind of nudge behavior in the right direction, or be used as mechanisms to help guide people to the right culture and the right security behaviors that we want. I feel very fortunate to have Bruce on the show. I found his podcast and I approached him and he said yes. So this is a big deal for me. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Bruce Hallas. Bruce, how are you? So as we film this, you're actually sitting in France, aren't you? So
Yes.
how's all that going?
It's going very well. It's going very well. The room I'm currently in is actually where they used to keep the sheep, apparently.
I see. The provincial France then,
Yeah,
perhaps?
yeah. We moved to France last year on the West Coast. We spent a year there, did the lockdown for 6 months there, and then we moved to Northern Provence, which is we've been here for about, I don't know, about 6-7 weeks. So we'll spend a year here, and then we'll sort of make a decision about where we want to actually stay in France. Yeah.
Wow, what an amazing spot you're in. So, and thank you so much for coming in from, France to me in New Zealand. This is amazing to actually set this up. Well, thank you for saying yes, because when I first discovered you, well, your podcast, which is Rethinking the Human Factor, I found it because security culture and human behavior is a real passion area of mine, as I know it is yours. And so when I discovered your podcast, it put this massive smile on my face, and I was like, I think this is actually a bit of a kindred spirit I've got going on here. And you've got this really good story of how you became interested in human behavior and culture, and it took you down lots of different pathways, as it did with my career as well. Pathways that you wouldn't think necessarily would end up in security potentially as a discipline. So can you share with our listeners what your story is and how you your pathway to that rethinking the human factor?
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, to go back quite some time now. So I guess when I was at university, I studied law, finance, and marketing. And then, much to my father's disappointment, I decided not to become a lawyer, having incurred all the cost. And I sort of just went and trod my own path. And then, I don't know, it was about 29. I took on a role in the title was around IT security.
Okay.
Working for one of the UK's biggest value-added resellers, and I was basically asked, can you look at whether or not there is a business case for IT security? And I spent the first 3 months just looking at it and going, okay, what is IT security? The one thing for sure is I didn't have any technical skills, and I think I was recruited by the MD on the grounds that he said, "Can you do a presentation?" I said, "Sure." And the other candidates all did presentations around technology, and whereas I took the catalogue that belonged to the company, and I looked in the summary that he had written and signed, and I picked out all the bits that I thought were, he was saying, these are the things that are important to me. These are the values which are embedded within the organization. And I built my presentation all around the values that clearly he felt were really important. And he said, "Look, you're the only person that talked to me in the context of what's really important to me." He said, "Everybody else talked about technology. We talked about actually the things that are important to me as the owner of the business." Anyway, and I think that was partly driven by my marketing background, the training I'd done, and understanding that people are actually really focused on, what's in it for them is different for different people. In this case, this is the owner of the business. This is their life. And I built my presentation around the values that were associated with them. But anyway, I looked at IT security. I quickly said, IT, it's really just a means of inputting, storing, processing, and distributing information. So I said, look, I prefer calling it information security. And we developed two sides to what I was doing. I was helping their customers, but also helping them. Okay. And it was a really interesting journey, because I think my success in the early years was based upon the fact that I would work with IT directors, IT managers, who were back then the people who were looking at security on the whole. And my job was a translator. And my job was to translate, the IT requirement into something the finance director understood. So I would talk about it in terms of impact, cash flow, profitability, those types of things. So I would talk to the marketing director in terms of impact of brand, reputation, those types of things. I would talk to the lawyer in the house, the company secretary, or the external lawyer advising them. I said, look, and these are our legal obligations. So I talked to him in terms of the law. And it was interesting because there, what I was doing, translating, was turning up something that somebody believed in anyway. The IT director said, look, security really is important. But saying, it's great that you believe it's important, but you're not the person that's approving the budget and the spend. You're not the person that's going through the change, who has to put up with the changes that are going to have to happen here on your own. So being able to communicate to people in a language they actually understood, and also a lot of it was culturally, there was a lot of cultural context within that language, was I guess what helped me get to the point now where I'm 20 years into my career. 7 years ago, I started looking at the human factor, and that was partly driven because I've been doing lots of governance, risk, and compliance for years, and helping organisations define, look, this is our acceptable use policy, this is our information security policy, these are all our policies, and they were spending significant time and resource writing these policies, basically saying, the board was saying, this is our expectation, and we're writing it in this policy. We couldn't be any clearer. So, well, sometimes they could. And then somebody's job was to actually communicate that to all of the employees and contractors and suppliers, and to get them on board so that they bought into the whole cultural context of things, the whole need for a change in the culture. And what I realized very quickly was that a lot I could have been better. I really started to look at my work and say, look, you do all this work, and actually as a security professional, I was passionate about bringing around change, not about writing policy.
Yes,
about writing policy. It was about bringing around change for the good of the company and for society. And I sort of made a commitment. I stepped back. I took about 30% of my time. I don't work doing consulting work and training work. It's just research, and it's a commitment to how can I improve what I do. And then very quickly, when I realized it, I was like, when I kicked off the Rethinking Human Factor program, I was like, oh my, as an industry, that we have so much opportunity to really, really shift the needle in the right direction when it came to awareness, behavior, and culture. So yeah, I guess that's the journey that I've been on.
Yeah. That policy example is a really relevant one for me. I think about it a lot, and I have a lot of conversations with my colleagues at work about that, that we kind of need to get to this whole policy 3.0 or something where, yes, you've got your written policy that, has all the rules in it, but we need to kind of take them and turn them into whatever the person who's going to consume them likes best, or, So, for example, if they're a checklist person, can it be turned into a checklist? If they're a meme person, can it be turned into a meme? If they're infographic or, whatever it is, how can we communicate these policies in a way that people are actually gonna, listen to them and, like say, have that behavior change happen? But it takes quite a bit of work when you start thinking that way, because you're talking about personalizing things for people.
Yeah, but I think that we shouldn't be scared of work.
No, absolutely. Particularly if it's effective, having an effect, an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the whole thing about trying to make it as easy as possible, the easy option for us as security professionals is to we'll get it written down and we'll communicate it out. It's the easy option for not just for us as security professionals, but for everybody. Yeah. And then you're sort of, and I mean, and that sort of need to be easy is deeply ingrained in what it means to be human, our psychology, isn't it? It's like we always choose the easiest route,
path of least resistance.
Do I go to the gym? I know it's better for me in the long run. Okay, or do I stay at home because it's dark outside and it's wet and all those stuff? So we always get drawn as humans to the easy option, and yet we do know that actually taking the harder option will generally, in the long term, produce results. And I do wonder whether, as an industry, we're sort of almost like behaving in the way that we know we don't want our audience to behave. It's just like the easy option, because I think you're right. If you went back, if you thought about this at not just the planning stage in terms of we've got the policy, now we've got to communicate it. In my experience and the research I've done, actually a lot of it is about the policy. I have this phrase I've used for years, okay, and you use the phrase consume, and it's something like, it's like, if security was a product, would you buy it? And if you bought it, would you buy it again? Okay, it comes from that consumerist society where you go, okay, I originally came up with this. I was stood in the petrol station. I was going to pay for my petrol, and on the left-hand side, I still remember there was all these chocolates and sweets and everything else that to tempt you to buy something. And I was looking at them, and I just suddenly started thinking, well, security policy is just another policy. All these chocolates are just different policies from different organizational departments. And my job as a security professional responsible for awareness, behavior, behavior, and culture is get people to buy my bar.
Okay? Yes, that's a fantastic analogy. Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I've got them to buy the bar. They've looked at the bar. They've gone, oh, wow, it's lovely wrapping. It looks like a luxurious. I like really good quality chocolate. So it's like 80% and above chocolate. I like the wrapping. It's at the right price bracket. It's on the right eye level, so it immediately catches my attention. And oh yeah, there we go. Pick it up, put it on the counter. And when I eat it, okay, is it everything it promised to be? Because if it isn't everything it promised to be, will I buy that chocolate again? And this is the thing for me with security. You can do that awareness campaign and communicate it out, but sometimes the product isn't right for the audience. So you can communicate it in the meme and checklists and all these other bits and pieces, and they are all definitely ways of doing it and will significantly shift the needle in the right direction. But sometimes, we dress something up. It's an awful thing, but we dress it up to make it look like it's great. And actually,
the product still has to be the right product. Yeah,
that's right. So I think that's the interesting challenge for us, in information security, but not just security, in all aspects of society where we're trying to change behavior. Is you go, okay, there's the communication of the actual behavior you want, but then there's the actual defining of the behavior that you want as well. And sometimes you can communicate to death a really bad behavioral, something that's really difficult for people. and you know, you can spend a lot of time and money on it, and actually it doesn't produce much results. And that's where, for me, one of the big stories I take out is, look, sometimes it's about the product that you being asked to communicate and to get people to buy into. Sometimes it's just not going to work.
Yes, yeah. Interesting. And I love that analogy of the chocolate bars in the petrol station, and which one do you actually pick up and which one do you actually buy again. That's great. So on this journey, have you had any key influences or any real kind of aha moments where you just totally knew you were heading in the right direction? You must have been on this journey a similar time to me, I think. So yeah, I'm keen to hear what yours were.
I think if you take it from when I look back, even when I go back to my degree, law, finance, marketing, every one of those was all about awareness, behavior, and culture. And then when I was doing my research around the Rethinking Human Factor program, I kicked it off, and very quickly I focused on really what are the objectives I'm looking to make people aware of, what our expectations are of them. I'm looking to then increase the odds in our favor that their behavior will change, or that their behavior, if it's already right, will remain the same, because I think we lose that often. Yeah, I mean, we talk about changing behavior. but actually, one of the big challenges is getting people to stay doing the things that they're already doing when it's right. So as an industry, we are fixated on behavioral change. Okay, but actually there are a significant portion of any workforce who are really, really complying with the policy, and we seem to sort of neglect that. And we're focused on the smaller numbers, okay, who are really focused, who are determined not to comply, or who just don't comply just on an unconscious level. And if you don't actually think about the people that do comply and how to keep them complying, you actually stand to lose probably the biggest influence you can have on the outlanders. Because it's those people who stick to the behaviors if there's a lot more of them, they're the ones that are in contact with the people who are not complying day in, day out. You as a security professional are not. Your ambassador is possibly communicating with them or engaging with them, but probably not as much as everybody else in the team.
Yes.
So I think a real big miss, where it's a real big opportunity rather than miss.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
It's about how do we keep the good behaviors going? How do we make people aware of that? And then there's a cultural side. So I think when I realized that, I was like, God, I look at law and I go, well, law is basically, here's the law. I'm going to make you aware of it. Here it is. Okay. Don't drive over 30 miles an hour. Okay. And there's a big sign on the roads, 30 miles an hour, different symbols in different countries. But basically the same law. Don't drive over 30, not age, okay? But don't drive over 30 kilometers an hour or miles an hour, okay? And then, you know, there's like the behavioral piece that then might be coming from and if you don't comply, okay, and you get caught, okay, then this is the potential penalty, you know, a speed fine, you know, points on your license, all that sort of stuff. And then finance was the same. Every financial report is just making people aware of the financial situation at a given time. Why do we make people aware of the financial situation at a given time? Do we make them just because we want to make them aware, or do we make them aware so that so the people that read that report, who can understand the figures and what's being said, can understand the context in it? They'll look at it and they go, that's not good enough. Our cash flow is too low there. Things are getting too tight there. Okay, our margins seem to be too low there. Why is the Far East outperforming South America? Okay, these are all in points of consideration to then change behavior.
That's so true. I hadn't thought about it that way.
And then you look at it and you go, okay, culture. Okay, the symbol that you put 30 miles an hour in. Okay, you know, we tend to sort of, in certain countries, we tend to surround that symbol in red. Because what does red mean?
Danger. Yeah.
Okay, well, it means danger in some cultures, but not in all. Okay, so but you know, for me, I go, yeah, anything that's red in the UK, Western Europe, Australia, for example, New Zealand. So a red is often used as it attracts your attention. It's associated with danger. It has that thing, and that's a primeval. That's going way, way, way back. You know, we look at red as a danger color. But it's also embedded to us as soon as we're born, you know, as we're moving through everything that we see, which is all about urgency, danger, is all red. So culturally, as we grow up, our culture, our society embeds in us that red is a warning color as well. Then you put 30 miles an hour in it. I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but you know, over in the UK, where I spent quite a bit of my life, we go, 30 miles. What they actually mean by that, I can drive 10% above 30, so I can do 33, and I'll be okay. Okay, and it's the same with the motorways and that, and there's this margin of error, and there's so many stories about where does this 10% come from. And it's like, well, it's the speed devices. There's a margin of error that they have to put into it. Or maybe it's like, you know, the enforcement people, the police, for example, actually applying a degree of common sense, if it is common sense at all. But the interesting thing is, I had this moment in my research, and I was like, what aspect of much of what we do, especially within the work context, and even in education, across the whole of society, what aspect of it isn't about trying to raise awareness amongst people to then ultimately influence behavior, hopefully in the right direction, but you know, not always, obviously, and to then embed that into culture so that it becomes just part and parcel of life's journey, and what part of culture influences that. And I think that, I know that doesn't look at it within the context of information security, data protection, but information security and data protection is just another example, or you know, the same problems of awareness, behavior, and culture.
Yes.
And I think it's when I had that moment, that was genuinely a moment for me where I was like, oh my gosh. And that's one of the things about my podcast and people that read my book. Quite often, they're not people who work in information security.
Yeah.
And that's why our guests on our show, when I kicked off my own research, the one thing I realized very quickly, I was like, okay, you know, we've got the information security industry that's only really just starting to peek under the cover of the human factor. I was like, but you know, there are all these other people who've been doing awareness, behavior, and culture for like decades, and even more than decades, who've got a lot more experience, a lot more skills, have made a lot more mistakes, and therefore know a lot more about the things to avoid and the things to do. And that's why in my research, I basically had two streams of work. The biggest stream by far was actually spending time with people outside the security industry and learning from them. The podcast, the theme has always been very much about trying to interview people from outside security industry, data protection, and bring them in. And even the book reflects very much upon, you know, stuff from outside and brings it back in within an information security context. So I think that for me was probably the big aha moment. It wasn't so much about information security and data protection.
Yes.
It was more about, actually, the challenge is not unique to us, and we would do well to move our compass and look at people that have been doing it for far longer, and learn from them, and then wrap it in our context. I mean, that's the one thing they can't give. I interviewed Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral psychologist, and Gert-Jan Hofstede is probably one of the world's best known specialists when it comes to culture. I interviewed them. It took me 2 years to get them on the show, and that's because it took me quite a long time to actually educate them about why what they were talking about actually relates to security.
Relevant.
Yeah,
absolutely. And kind of following on from that as well, I think you're right. It is one of the problems that security does have in relation to the way it communicates itself and presents itself to people and organizations. And when I've spoken to board and exec teams in particular, they seem to be pretty uncomfortable still when the topic of security comes to the table, or there's a paper of security for the board to kind of read and ask good governance questions on. And I think it's kind of exactly what you've summed up. There's something about the way we communicate security or frame it up that perhaps doesn't have the greatest meaning for people. We need to do a better job of showing the value to organizations. So that, because the ultimate goal for me is, for example, if I'm presenting to a board and exec team, that they're talking about it and engaging in what I'm talking about. But there's usually only one or two, maybe just one, because they're just not sure. So how do we reframe security or get more people around the table involved?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I find when communicating with people, and this probably comes from my legal training, but it is, when you think about it, it just sounds like, oh yeah, why not? But it's, I'll give you an example. So I was interviewed relatively recently, and I was asked a question about ambassador networks. And, I think ambassador networks definitely have a place. Definitely.
Like champions in organizations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, for everybody that's listening to this show who's like, I've got a great idea, they've got to go and get buy-in from the stakeholders. And I don't mean just buy-in to actually, put the money on the table to make it happen. I mean, really, the buy-in is about actually the change that needs to happen, not necessarily just the making the money available to pay for you to do the work. And what happens, and you just giving an illustration of this, you go to the stakeholders, and you've got to present to them. Now, you have an argument, and the logic in you is saying, okay, I'll present this and that's going to work. But actually, the reality is that you're trying to influence those people around the table. So what you actually have to do is you actually have to understand what objections they're going to raise. Okay, if you only go in there to have a conversation with people where your conversation is completely focused on your business case as you see it, but you don't understand that there will always be somebody in the audience who will object. Now, their reasons for objecting could be absolutely a myriad of things. I mean, it could be personal, it could be politics, it could be, I've just had a really bad start to the day. It could also be the fact that from a behavioral perspective, a psychology perspective, some people will suddenly see change. And that brings up whenever there's change, and especially if it's something within their area of the business and they're already overladen with work, that the side of the brain that's working is no longer the logical bit. You're now being driven by fear. Okay, and fear means you're going to rely upon biases and heuristics, and biases don't always work in our favor. By actually understanding this stuff, what you actually do is you actually then say, okay, so this is how I would normally present, but now I'm going to also plan and prepare for all this. So when I am presenting, okay, I am aware that there's going to be somebody in that audience who's going to be thinking, okay, I'm not buying into that, or I'm resistant to it, whatever. And that gives you if you're prepared for it, in that 10 minutes you get, because that's one of the hard things, isn't it? You're like, I've got time with the board. And the board have said, you've got 10 minutes. Okay.
Yes.
You're like, okay, so when, if you go in there and you don't get what you need there, okay, then the challenge that you're going to have is, when can I next get in front of the board? And then I work with CISOs and say, well, I've got to start with the board every so often, actually. And statistically, when I speak to them about how well it went, a lot of them say, I didn't get as much time as I wanted, or actually I was made to wait 3 or 4 hours and I hadn't actually had anything to eat. Now, people say, well, you haven't had anything to eat. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is if you haven't got enough energy, okay, the side of the brain, what happens is, if your blood energy level, if your calories that are available to actually burn, your energy that fuels the brain, basically what happens is, from an evolutionary perspective, you end up using one side of the brain more instead of the other. Now, you basically move from the logical side to what is called more emotion and fear driven. Okay, so actually, and it's really interesting because that means that you're probably less able to cope with questions and to be able to actually respond in a way that's going to make logical sense to those other people. So even the thing about, this thing about people say, oh, I've been delayed by 4 hours, still haven't got to the board. It's 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
That's actually having an impact on the likelihood of them being effective when they're in front of the board and answering the question. So you've got to do whatever you can to prepare for the event.
Peak condition when you're doing it.
Yeah.
And
go. Sorry.
I was going to say, in terms of the messagings for boards and execs, one technique I have found, one way to do it that has been quite successful is you talk to them, not necessarily, it's about security, but you reframe it all around the customer. So it's like kind of what you're talking about with your marketing kind of background. You talk about it in terms of impacts on the customer, benefits for the customer, that kind of language with that kind of group, depending on what the organization does.
Yeah. No, and that's absolutely,
and tend to turn the conversation around.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. I mean, you've got conversations at different points as well. So it's really interesting. I've been having chats with somebody about culture, a cultural context around presenting to boards. Now, in a lot of cultures, especially Western influenced cultures, actually the decision's already been made before you get to the board. Okay, and part of what your role is, for that I try and introduce people to is that, who are the stakeholders? Stakeholder relationship building is partly about, getting to know people, but it's also then it's sort of talking through. So you've basically got the stakeholders already aligned before you get to the board meeting, and the board meeting is actually just the point where they go, yes. And it's recorded officially in the meeting notes. The decision's already been made individually, and then you get them together. As long as when you've got them together, if at that point something suddenly gets unraveled, then you've got a challenge. But that's part of the preparation you've got to do to be a success in terms of putting your business case together. Is about pre-prep, pre-made decisions, really, and really the board meeting is just a case of signing off and recording it officially. But a word of warning on that one, not all cultures buy into that. There are, even in sort of like Northern European cultures, for example, there is, it's more of a, the board meeting can be more of a discussion.
Yes.
It's not just a point of recording the decisions that have already been made. But yeah, so you can tailor to individuals based upon the things that are really important. So you're like, okay, I know the KPIs. I mean, if you don't know the KPIs of your stakeholders, you're set up to fail. So for me, when I do risk assessments, it's always to the KPIs of the stakeholders. I'm like, okay, right. So simple ones: cash flow, profitability. The next one is brand. Brand reputation, brand image, all these things. And so when you understand the KPIs, and these are the things that people get measured against, which are in their business plans. So it's not like you have to go delving very deep. If that documentation is available within the business, the KPI should be there. They should be reporting them. I mean, in the early days, I used to ask, what is the report that goes forward to the board? And in that, you'd find these are the KPIs, these are the things that they're being measured against. So my risk assessment, my understanding of, I would frame it in this is how, if this happens, okay, this is how it's going to affect your KPIs. Okay, and they will go, it's a simple question, do you want that to happen? No. They would then turn around and go, well, how likely is that to happen? That's the importance in any element of security data protection, any element of business management, is what's your strategy for making sure you have the data, so that when somebody says, how likely is that to happen, you either go, globally, this is the sort of stats. In our specific industry sector, this is the sort of stats. In our organization itself, this is the stats. And so when they get the objections, you go, here you go, there's the industry figures, there's our own figures. People looking at it and go, oh, wow, we're above or below industry at the moment. And they go, yeah, that means it's more likely or less likely to happen. And that helps them think about, oh, well, so it's not just that it could happen, it's just that it is happening. And it's happened 4 times in the last 6 months. Okay, so, yeah, so let's take this seriously. And and that's how you can, I think that's how you can frame that discussion around any sort of effort to get support for change when it comes to security.
So, in what we've been talking about in terms of preparing for that kind of discussion, we've been talking about stakeholder mapping. We've talked a lot about, the kind of marketing things that chief information security officers and chief information officers have to do.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite a wide business skill set that you've sort of been talking through here. And I'm just wondering, the more you get into rethinking the human factor, do you think that, what does it mean for those particular roles? Are they needing to evolve? Are they evolving? Or have you got any predictions on how those roles might develop in the future? Because it's not just security anymore. You're talking pretty wide scope of skills.
Well, it's interesting. I guess that's a really interesting question, and I guess there's a number of questions within that. I think the first one is, let me just tell you, have you heard of something called the Information Security from the ISF? Yes. Okay, yeah, they're sort of they have been for quite some time pretty forward-thinking, very strong within in Europe. I think they're sort of branching into North America more now, a bit more push, and I think they're down in your part of the world as well. But I was asked to do a presentation at an ISF conference, and at the end, and it was around the sort of the human factor aspects. And I was asked for a prediction at the end of that presentation, and it was for the future CISO 2030.
Right.
So my prediction is that the future CISO of 2030 will have a background in behavioral psychology, or will have at least done some training, and that it'll be part of what it means to be CISO. And I think I made that prediction in 2014. And it's interesting to see how things are changing. Yes. People like yourself, your background is behavioral focus, it is psychology, etc. And I'm seeing that there's a younger generation than me. You'd be part of that younger generation, I'm sure. But it's so exciting to see it. It's like there are people coming in who are more focused around the human aspect. Because I find it really interesting. For years, the industry talked about people, process, technology. But as an industry, we've been focused on technology.
Yes.
We're sort of moving into the process bit with the governance, risk, compliance type of stuff. But actually, the bit that really makes a difference is the people bit. Okay, and for me, this is one of the exciting moments. I wish I was like 5-10 years younger. I'd be like, whoa, I've got the energy to deal with this. Okay, but it is one of the most exciting times when it comes in the world of security and data protection. Generally, is this sense of there is this opening up. There is this. I think people are suddenly starting to go, do you know what? Things aren't as good as they could be. Where's the change happening? And I think for me, it's around the behavioral side. So my prediction that I made at ISF, I still believe it's going to happen by 2030. I think the other prediction I have is that the CISO will have two sort of like people they go to in their most senior team. They'll have somebody on the technical side, okay, and then they'll have somebody on the human side. For me, the human aspects of security are so undervalued at the moment, but have the potential to make such a big change. You have to think about like a deputy CISO. Okay, you could have somebody who has more of a technical scope focus, and you have somebody who has more of a people focus. And governance, risk, and compliance to a certain degree are all people. I mean, risk. What is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is making people aware of the risk exposure so they can make decisions about what behaviors are right and wrong, or the best ones. Okay. A risk assessment is awareness exercise there to drive behavioral change where appropriate, where the appetite for risk is appropriate. Governance is, governance structures, formal structures are a core part of how cultures are formed and influenced, and not the only thing. Compliance is another core. It's just human. It's very, very human. Without humans, you wouldn't have risk. Without humans, you would have no need for governance. Without humans, you would have no compliance. So the human factor for me, from a security perspective, is I think it's there. So that's my other prediction, that that role will mature. Whether it's, you'll either find it skills at a CISO level or the deputy level below, is can you come up with a human-based strategy for information security and data protection, instead of let's do all the design work and development work up front, and then we're going to ask somebody to force it down, right? Communicate it to them until they change their behaviors, or incentivize them, or we're doing a lot of tactical work at the moment, which is interesting because people talk about ambassador networks, CBT training, gamification, emergency rooms, or emergency rooms, all these different tactical things. You go to any event and you see all these things going on tactically, and I look at it and I'm like, look, it's all good, but we're making the same mistake we made when I first got into security, where I used to sort of people say, well, we've got it sussed, and I go, well, how do you mean? You go, well, I've got antivirus here, I've got intrusion detection here, I've got firewalls here, I've got this, and they were talking all these tactical things.
Products, yeah.
And you talk to people about education and awareness, and I go, what is it you're doing around the human factor? And they say, oh, we've got CBT, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this, and I'm like, this is just an echo of what happened 15 years ago. And then about 5 to 10 years ago, we started to think, well, hey, that's not working. We've got to spend more time up front in the thinking piece, the development, and then rolling out, which goes back to the point right at the beginning of the interview you were making about, having the time to do that.
So I want to get a little bit under actually that whole culture and awareness piece, and how an organization can go about that. So let's talk specifically about your book, Rethinking the Human Factor, and your podcast of the same name. And, you've developed a framework that organizations can really use to tackle the human factor, and starting to get that working really well. So the security awareness, behavior, and culture framework.
Yep, say back. Yep, say back.
Yeah. That's the one. So can you give our listeners a little bit of a heads up on what that kind of looks like, or what that framework is about?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what my work about is trying to, I think what happens with a lot of frameworks, it's funny because what I'm trying to instill in people are what I call design principles. So I have this philosophy, and we sort of shared it, I guess, within the book, which is to design with the human in mind. And what we do is we try to introduce people into what it means to be human, because it's interesting, when we kicked off the initial piece of research, and we did, when I said that there were two elements of research, really. There was the one which was focused upon people outside of the security industry, and there's one focused on people in the security industry. And we looked at the one thing about everybody who worked outside the industry is that they had, on some level, an understanding of what it meant to be human. And on another, when we looked at the security industry and the people who were responsible, often CISOs, education and awareness managers, so there weren't that many back in those days. I think it's good to see the number increasing. But other security professionals who had another hat on, education and awareness was another hat. It wasn't a job for the person. It was almost like the hospital pass. To coin a rugby term, he or she got given the hospital pass. And I think It was interesting because the number of people who actually had any formal training or even informal understanding of what it really meant to be human was so low. And for me, that's a real starting point, and that's what we try to do. We actually try to introduce people like if your objective is to raise awareness amongst people, to influence behavior amongst people, to embed a culture amongst people, and vice versa, then surely the starting block is about understanding what it means to be human. It's a bit like, I want to do IT security, but I don't know anything about IT. Okay, and it's a fundamental failure in the foundation of any work around the human factor if you do not take the time to understand what it means to be human.
So what do you mean then? Like how we think, how we feel?
Yeah, I mean, I've given a couple of examples today. When I present, there's a couple of things that I share, but obviously because I train on this sort of stuff, I don't give away absolutely everything. But the couple of things that I do share, which in presentations always get people coming up to me afterwards, go, I never thought of that. And I've shared it today. The one about your energy level. So, the brain, it requires energy to work. It's really, it consumes a lot of our energy, okay? And when we don't have a lot of energy, it's got less to consume, which means that it doesn't work as efficiently. But through our evolutionary past, what we've basically been able to do is we've sort of, in the past, we didn't, we weren't able to go down to the shops and to pick something up. We didn't go down to the Starbucks and get ourselves, something for lunch. Our ability to actually have access to food or resources which we would consume to give us the energy to then be able to think cognitively went through ups and downs. And sometimes it was the seasons, sometimes it was, we just, we were ill and so we couldn't get access to for whatever. But the bottom line is, if your brain doesn't have the energy it needs, basically there's two sides to the brain. Okay, it will use one side of the brain in preference to the other. Okay. And that side of the brain contains what we call shortcuts. And the reason why it does that is to cognitively think requires much more energy. The brain needs to just use more energy. Okay. Whereas to use the other side of the brain, which is the shortcuts, requires a lot less energy. So it's just the brain surviving. It's just like, hey, do you know what? We ain't got much energy. Okay, so we're going to use this side of the brain, which doesn't use a lot of energy. It's got shortcuts. Yeah, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Quite often they don't, especially in this day and age, because we haven't evolved. The brain we've got here is like not a couple of centuries old. It's much further back.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, and so the environment we're making decisions in using our brains has, our brain is not fit for the environment we're making decisions in. We're bombarded with information all the time. We're under a lot of stresses that our brains wouldn't have been under, many years ago. And basically, we just haven't evolved as quickly as Moore's law. And that's really important because it's like, okay, so the energy level, people say to me, well, okay, so what does that mean? How does that have an impact? And so think about it. When are you doing your training? Because what the objective of training is the objective. If the objective of training is just to get people to go through the training program and not to think, okay, I can give you that training program anytime. If the objective of the training program is to go through the training program and to get people to think, to cognitively process information and to sort of reason with it, okay, that is taking a lot. That is burning through your energy levels. Okay. Now there are two outputs there. One could be we've done the awareness program. We just got them to watch it, and they ticked it at the end. Okay. The other one is we got them to do the training, and then we've assessed their competency in this time. Okay, so they've got to be able to remember. And then there's also, okay, there's remembering it. Here's a quiz. Okay. And the next one is, okay, apply that to these situations. So now an even different level of cognition. Okay. So when you think about it, you're like very little energy, possibly none, small amount of energy, and then you're shifting the needle of God. You know, we're burning through the calorie here. Now, when you think about it from a training perspective, when is the best time to do that? When you understand that actually I need them to use the side of the brain where the cognition is really at its best, versus the side of the brain where it's just like, you know what, it's just shortcuts.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So you start layering in all of those little pieces then
into that's not about how you design the course content. That's just the small point of when you deliver it.
They do it.
And the other thing we found from our research was that actually, when do people take the training? So invariably what we do is we say, hey, everyone, okay, you have got until 31st of September to complete this training. When do you think the majority of people complete the training?
Right before it ticks over to the 31st.
It's like it's the fourth email reminding everybody, okay, that we've got to do this by the 31st. And it's like, hey, do you know what? We really planned this wrong, because the 31st is actually the Friday. Okay. So, you know, so everybody's cramming it in maybe the Friday before they go away for the weekend. How focused are they? What is it they're actually focused on? Okay. And then like, oh God, they get that last reminder and they're like, okay, so they're doing it Friday afternoon. Okay. And you're like, okay, when's people energy at their lowest or highest? When's the peak time really for them to have a degree of energy, enough energy to be able to think cognitively and to be able to really take this on and to really make the most of that great training program you've spent ages putting together, and you've invested bringing in all these additional suppliers. And this is the thing for me, and this is this is the design with the human in mind, the principles about what I teach people is, hey, you go and spend 100,000 on CBT, you know, sign up to a contract because it makes economic sense for 5 years and get it for 300,000. Go and do this gamification, go and do all these things, okay? And they all, to a degree, have a benefit. The bottom line is the objective is bringing around awareness, behavior, and change. And actually, even you start to understand these small things, and I've only just talked about one thing, okay? And suddenly it's just like ding, 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 ding. And that is all about identifying marginal opportunities for improvement across not just your CBT, but absolutely everything. Okay, and it's interesting because those margins, when we talk about the people that aren't complying, I do genuinely believe that a majority of people really do want to comply. I do genuinely believe that out of the majority of people who really want to comply, a significant majority of those will actually comply. What we're focused upon in many ways is keeping those people compliant, but then think about how do we tweak things to help those people who are wanting to comply but don't, and those people who are not complying, really pushing them towards compliance. And that for me is why the design principles of Stay Back and the Rethinking Human Factor, and talking about how you actually apply them through a framework. That's what the framework does in many ways.
So I know you have a webinar that you also run, sort of to introduce people to this framework as well. That's on your website. Do you want to tell people your website where they can potentially sign up for that if they are interested? To learn more about Stay Back.
Yeah, so Stay Back, Rethinking the Human Factor is, I guess, Rethinking the Human Factor is the brand, but the company is called marmaladebox.com. So if you go to the www.marmaladebox.com website, you'll be able to find various ways of engaging with the vision that I have. we are in the process of putting together the Rethinking the Human Factor, a separate website as well, which just focuses purely on coaching programs that I run, the online training program, which will become available in January of 2021. So we're working really hard on taking what we do face-to-face at the moment because of the current situation. It's been great for 3 years now, but we're like, okay, we've got to get it online. And then the third thing that we're doing is a summit. So we're inviting people to come along, and as people say to me, they go, well, we expect you to do things differently. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, this is a different type of summit as well. So yeah, go to www.marmaladebox.com, or if you want, just drop me an email, bruce.hallas@marmaladebox.com.
Now, I'm guessing, particularly for that webinar, if people on that, because obviously I'm in New Zealand, it may have to be a different time for this side of the world.
That's right.
Because you've done the optimal time for probably your side of, so yeah, I guess thinking about that.
So it's really interesting. I've been really amazed the information security community in Australia, New Zealand, and Far East coming down into it. It was quite small compared to what obviously North America, massive community, only in Europe, but it is possibly was one of the earliest engages with my content, with what I was doing, the story I was taking out. I often found I got quite a lot of interest from people in Australia and New Zealand, and we've been trying along. And I think there's just something going on down there, which is just like, I think culturally there's this like willingness to challenge. That's what I'm really, there is culturally a willingness to challenge from that part of the world. It's just like there's less status quo bias, and there's like, okay, open to new ideas. And so there's one thing I got to do is I have got to organize webinars for hours which are a little more sociable.
That would be good. And maybe Australia, New Zealand,
with a beer and a glass of wine, and the webinar a road wreck.
Australia, New Zealand, like maybe not that we are smaller, but maybe that makes us more nimble and able to change and more happy to potentially as well.
I think culturally, I think there is something in Australia, New Zealand that for different reasons, but it seems to be prepared to, or less inclined to be just happy with the way things are. And sometimes it's like, okay, how can we, where are we going to be? And I think we've seen some examples. I know over in New Zealand, for example, in terms of how the pandemic has been tackled, but also how the Republic has responded to it. I think there are cultural values there at work, which mean that those cultural values are probably being applied in a lot of different aspects of life as well. So we'll get something set up so that I'm more sociable.
And kind of speaking of your framework, so when I sort of started looking at security culture and behavior, there seemed to be certain ways that you could nudge behavior, or different mechanisms that you could pull, and that kind of thing. And as I've gone into IT and digital transformation roles, it's occurred to me, actually, some of what I've learned myself around security culture can apply in this kind of digital transformation zone as well. Because what are you trying to do? You're trying to change culture and behavior and awareness to whatever it is, make people more capable or accepting of the technology change, or change their habits or processes or whatever it might be. Have you thought that as well? Because you've got this framework. set for security.
Mm.
Is there a chance to pivot it for digital? Because I think there might be.
Yeah, for sure. There is, but that's not what I want to do, because I think one of my interviews with Dr. John Cotter, who is like one of the world's best known specialist. He's an author, massive speaker. He's Harvard University, business school. I mean, he's just massive when it comes to change. So you've heard of, obviously you have, and
absolutely, yeah.
And I spent some time talking with him, and I think it's really interesting. One of the things that comes out from that conversation was how you can train somebody on a framework. Okay. And we do this, like we train people to implement ISO 27001, or we train people to implement NIST, or we train, and this is a weakness in any educational system that we currently have, really. Well, not any, but in majority of them, where we train people to pass the exam and then to apply what they've learned in the exam. But the application, there are two aspects to application, which I find in my experience make things work more effectively. There's one, being able to apply it and understanding the context within which you're applying it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I've got 20 plus years experience working in information security. I formerly trained in law, finance, and marketing. Okay. So I'm quite familiar with the current environment, but the challenges that we face within cybersecurity and data protection, because of my legal background, I get involved quite a lot with data protection as well. Okay. And I'm like, okay, so applying what I know within that context, okay, is something I can do, I hopefully pretty well. Yeah. Okay, I apply context to the bones of the framework. You get somebody that applies the framework but doesn't understand the context. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't implement it. It just means there's an additional resource required to help with the translation. And that additional resource, the resource might not be available, it might be expensive, or any one of those other things. So for me, I look at it like, okay, and John sort of alluded to it, because when he was talking about, he's teaching people, like, I guess, MBA. So I could teach you what you need to get your MBA, but the value of the MBA is not in knowing the MBA. It's about how effective you apply what you learn for the benefit of organization and society. Okay.
Fair enough.
That and so for me, I'm like, you're right. Because I looked at it and went, oh my God, there's so much of this I can apply. And I have, this is why I have the guests I have on the podcast, so people that aren't necessarily in security, and I'm talking to them, and we're actually getting on really well, because we're talking about applying the same stuff to the same challenges, but their environment is something different to mine. And I think what I provide for people working in cybersecurity who are responsible for change in terms of awareness, behavior, and culture within cybersecurity data protection is, hey, I've got this framework. Okay. But I've wrapped it in my own experience of information security, data protection, so that I understand where the problems you're facing. I understand probably how to implement this. In fact, it's been designed with your challenges in mind. And actually, so one of the things I have been approached by other people is to say, look, don't do cyber, but is there any way I could attend a training to learn those basic human design principles? Okay, so I could then maybe go and apply them in the context of internal communications. Yes. Yeah. We've had people from learning and development. I mean, it's great when we had learn at the workshop. We had somebody from internal comms, somebody from learning and development, and I was there. I was like, okay, so you're looking at L&D and comms around cybersecurity, and they were like, yes. They said, but what part of internal comms isn't about raising awareness or influencing behavior? And, the L&D person was like, yeah, it's great. We train people, they pass the course, but actually, so we tick their box. But actually, what we want them to do with the skills, we want them to use the skills to influence their behavior. And they said, so we're seeing opportunities there. And I think it's interesting. You look at the internal communications profession and the L&D profession, there has been, I don't know if you noticed this yourself, there has been an increase in rhetoric around the application of behavioral economics, choice architecture, nudge theory, the type of things that we've sort of been talking about today. So, it does apply.
Yeah, and you did mention that you're getting like the type of people who read your book aren't just security people. It actually,
well, we had a commissioner from the European Union who was the ex-European commissioner for health, and he came on the show.
Oh, fabulous!
I think because he was like he was sort of interested. He stumbled across my work on Twitter. That was it, on Twitter. And he said, look, we have a policy about health within the European Union. I have 27 countries, one less now. And he said, and they all have different cultures. Okay. But our job is to get that policy, which we signed off, implemented in all those different countries. When you think about it from a security perspective, you go, what do you do? Well, I've got an information security policy. What do you need to do? I need to embed it across all these different business departments in all these different countries. The same problems he was facing. And we spoke about it within his experience of those challenges within the health environment. And so you're just like, it can apply to
makes sense.
All aspects of life, really.
Absolutely. All right. So what are you looking forward to, Bruce? What's coming up?
2030, by which time, things that I guess are exciting which are happening. So for me, as an individual, we pretty much everything we've done face to face. So I mean, I just personally believe that it really does make a difference doing things face to face. But sometimes the situations are such that you can't do it face to face. We've all been going through that in this year, and I suspect probably into the early part of next year, possibly further. So we've basically taken all the things we need to do workshop wise, training wise, and coaching wise, and we're putting that all online. So we've got a coaching program for one-to-one coaching with CISOs, education and awareness managers. And then we've got a coaching program where we get 5 people together in a group, and basically I coach them through the SABAC framework. So there's the rethinking the human factor piece, which is like introducing you to the design principles, and there's and how might I apply that through a framework which could double up as your strategy for the next 3 years when it comes to the human factor. So we've got that going, which is really exciting, and it's had some knockbacks as we've been moving around France. It's been a real challenge keeping up the pressure on doing that, but we're really, really close to finishing that now. Series 4 of the podcast is totally going to be awesome. It's really interesting. We've got some regulators coming on the show to talk about, what is the role of a regulator and their own experience around awareness, behavior, and culture, because that's a massive challenge for them. But then also trying to dig deep into, so when you say education and awareness in this piece of legislation, this regulation, what do you actually mean? And how much of a problem are you causing by using the phrase education and awareness? Because for me as a security professional, I'm like, one of our biggest challenges is that the board say, well, we've educated them and we've made them aware. Okay, for the CISO, it's like, but I really need them to change their behavior to reduce the risk in line with your appetite. But it doesn't say behavior and culture, does it?
Yeah, that's true.
And so this one, I'm going to be asking the regulators is like, look, I know you didn't write this, but you definitely have a role to play in getting law written and regulation written. Please understand that currently one of the biggest challenges we face in security, data protection, is that when we go to the board, they might very well be taking the position of it's education awareness.
Yeah.
And if you put in behavior and culture, do you know what I said? That what that potentially means is that the board goes, okay, so we've got to focus on behavior and culture, and that shifts the focus from education and awareness to behavior and culture. And that's a massive passion of mine is that
That's a small shift, but actually it is quite different, isn't it?
It for me, from the research, and this is, I guess, a really big thing I'm pushing into 2021, and that's why we're getting the regulators on board to have these conversations, is to say, look, the evidence is that people say it's compliance driven, and so we're trying to change. We're trying to change that. We're trying to say to people, it's compliance driven. So how can we do things better? It's not. How can we change the board? Actually, it's just a really the other way of looking at it is, well, just change those 3 words.
Yeah.
And people say, well, that's easier said than done. And then I said, well, actually, it's interesting because when you speak to regulators, and I do talk to quite a few now, there's a lot of interest in the work that I'm doing. They all have as their objective, they are all that regulation is there to basically embed the values of society. Okay, and to do that, they have to they make people aware of what the values are, but also they have to influence behavior and culture. So they are facing the same problem that we face as education awareness managers, CISOs. And then my story with them, I guess my narrative with them, is very much along the line, look, you're all about behavior and culture. That is what you're effectively trying to change, and you're asking us to do that. But these 3 single words are preventing us being a success, which prevents you from being a success. So a big part of what I'm going to be doing in 2021 is like trying to marshal that discussion across the world to say to people, look, we need to engage with the regulators to make them aware that actually the problems they face are the same problems that we face, and that actually by actually working together on the next range of regulations to shift the focus to behavior and culture, they will be more successful. We will be more successful. So, it's a really big thing for me as well in 2021.
Well, I love that. And I'm looking forward to season 4 starting up. When is that due? Is it,
that will be due in Q1 next year. So,
right.
Yeah. And then I guess the final thing is we are going to run this summit. It will be the first time I've ever done an online summit. We've been approached by a small number of people who said, look, we really like what you do with the podcast. We like the insights you bring. Could you do anything online as a summit? And then there's a coaching program off the back of it. So I think one of the things that we get a lot of feedback on, people do events, but then they're like, okay, what do I do with this stuff? Well,
yes,
the people can join us for the coaching program.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Bruce. It's been such a treat and a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for saying yes to be on, and I wish you all the best in terms of rethinking the human factor, and I'll be watching and listening eagerly.